explorations and our movement activism in ways that enlarge and expand and complicate and deepen our theories and practices of freedom. Feminism involves so much more than gender equality, and it involves so much more than gender. Feminism it must involve a consciousness of capitalism. I mean, the feminism that I relate to. And there are multiple feminisms, right? So it has to involve a consciousness of capitalism and racism and colonialism and post-colonialities and ability and more genders that we can even imagine and more sexualities than we ever thought we could name. Feminism has helped us not only to recognize a range of connections among discourses and institutions and identities and ideologies that we often tend to consider separately, but it has also helped us to develop epistemological and organizing strategies that take us beyond the categories women and gender. And feminist methodologies impel us to explore connections that are not always apparent. And they drive us to inhabit contradictions and discover what is productive in these contradictions. Feminism insists on methods of thought and action that urge us to think things together that appear to be separate and to disaggregate things that appear to naturally belong together. Now, the assumption has been that because transgender and gender non-conforming populations are relatively small within a prison system, that in the US constitutes almost 2.5 million people and more than 8 million people in jails and prisons worldwide. And therefore, why should they deserve very much attention? But feminist approaches to the understanding of prisons, and indeed the prison industrial complex, have always insisted that, for example, if we look at imprisoned women, who are also a very small percentage throughout the world, we learn not only about women in prison, but we learn much more about the system as a whole than we would learn if we looked exclusively at men. Thus, also a feminist approach would insist both on what we can learn from and what we can transform with respect to trans and gender non-conforming prisoners, but also it insists on what this knowledge and activism tell us about the nature of punishment writ large, about the very apparatus of the prison. It is true that we cannot begin to think about the abolition of prisons outside of an anti-racist context. It is also true that abolition embraces that prison abolition, anti-prison abolition, must also embrace the abolition of gender policing. And that very process reveals the epistemic violence, and the feminist studies students in here know what I'm talking about, the violence that is inherent in the gender binary in the larger society. So bringing feminism within an abolitionist frame, and vice versa, bringing abolition within a feminist frame, means that we take seriously the old feminist adage that the personal is political. The personal is political. Everybody remembers that, right? The personal is political. And we can follow the lead of Beth Ritchie in thinking about the dangerous ways in which the institutional violence of the prison complements and extends the intimate violence of the family, of the relationship, the individual violence of battery and sexual assault. We also question whether incarcerating individual perpetrators does anything more than reproduce the very violence that the perpetrators have allegedly committed. There is criminalization, but the problem persists. And it seems to me that people who are working on the front line of the struggle against violence against women, they should also be on the front line of abolitionist struggles. And people opposed to police crime should be opposed to what is constructed as domestic violence. There's public violence and there's privatized violence. There's a feminist philosophical dimension of abolitionists, both abolitionist theories and practices. The personal is political. There is a deep relationality that links struggles against institutions and struggles to reinvent our personal lives and recraft ourselves. We know, for example, that we replicate the structures of retributive justice oftentimes in our own emotional responses. Someone attacks us, verbally or otherwise, our response is what? A counterattack. The retributive impulses of the state are inscribed in our very emotional responses. The political reproduces itself through the personal. This is a feminist insight, a Marxist-inflected feminist insight that perhaps reveals some influence of Foucault. This is a feminist insight regarding the reproduction of the relations that enable something like the prison industrial complex.